Her name was Eleanor Shaw. At the church social, Deputy Roy Callum reached across the table and cut her meat for her, cut it into small pieces, said she'd tremble it off the plate otherwise. The women laughed, soft and kind, the way you laugh at a child. Eleanor thanked him. She did not color. Then, the cattle buyer stood. Cole Ferris. Smooth as poured cream. He tipped his hat to the room and said, "Careful, gentlemen. The little schoolteacher looks like she'd faint at a loud door." 40-some souls chuckled into their coffee. Eleanor said nothing. She only watched his hands. 12 days later, 5 masked men emptied the Cattlemen's bank in broad daylight. The marshal had nothing. No faces, no names, and the same trembling schoolmarm came quietly to his door and asked if she might have a word, because she had counted something no one else in that town had thought to count. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go on, do this one small thing. Tap subscribe, and in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from. I read every one. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. The stagecoach came up the Cottonwood Road on a bright, cold morning in the spring of 1878. Colorado Territory. The mountains still wore snow. The town of Cottonwood Fork sat in a bowl of green, one long street, a church at one end and the Cattlemen's bank at the other, and a schoolhouse in between with a bell that had not rung in 4 months. The coach stopped in front of the general store. A young woman climbed down. She was small. Plain gray dress, a plain gray bonnet, a face that would not draw a second look on a busy day. She had 2 trunks. The driver set them in the dust, and she thanked him twice, and her voice caught on the second thank you. A little stammer that made a man standing nearby smile without meaning to. That was Eleanor Shaw, 26 years old, the town's new schoolmarm, come all the way from back east to teach the children their letters and their sums. She stood there a moment with her 2 trunks and looked at the street. Not the way a newcomer looks at a strange place, all wide and lost. She looked at it plain. Left, then right, the church, the bank, the alley between the feed store and the barber. She counted the ways out of that street without knowing she counted them. It was a habit older than she was comfortable with. The women of the town came for her within the hour. Mrs. Abernathy led them. She was the banker's wife and the president of the ladies' circle, and she took one look at Eleanor's thin wrists and her stammer and decided that this poor creature would need managing. She said as much, warmly, kindly. She took the lighter of the 2 trunks herself and directed 2 of the younger women to carry the other between them. "You'll be worn to a thread from that journey," Mrs. Abernathy said. "We'll get you settled, dear. Don't you trouble yourself over a thing." They walked her up the street to the little house behind the schoolhouse. They swept a floor that was already swept. They put up curtains. They filled her larder from their own kitchens and clucked over how little she'd think to eat, a bird like her. Eleanor let them. She said thank you. And thank you, and thank you. She let them arrange her life like they were arranging flowers in a vase. But when the 2 young women went to carry the second trunk into the bedroom, Eleanor crossed the floor quick and quiet and took the handle from them. "I'll see to that one," she said. "It's only books. Heavy books. I couldn't ask it." She smiled to soften it. They gave it up easily. And she set that trunk against the wall of her bedroom, and she did not open it while they were there. It had a lock on it. A good lock. Later, when they'd all gone home, she pushed it into the corner and laid a quilt over the top of it like it was a table and not a thing. That was the first trunk she kept locked. Remember it. The town made up its mind about her fast. Small towns do. By the end of that first week, everyone in Cottonwood Fork knew exactly who Eleanor Shaw was. She was delicate, she was sweet, she was Eastern and fine-boned and probably not long for the frontier, poor thing, and everyone agreed she must be handled gently, like a china cup you'd hate to see broken. Deputy Roy Callum took it upon himself to be her protector. He was a big man, loud, quick to laugh at his own jokes, and quicker to make sure a room heard them. He had ambitions. He wanted, more than anything, to be the man people looked to. And a fragile schoolmarm was a fine thing to stand in front of. He walked her home from church that first Sunday. He walked between her and the street, so a passing horse wouldn't startle her. When two ranch hands got to arguing outside the saloon, he steered her wide around them with a hand at her elbow. "You don't want to see that sort of thing, Miss Shaw," he said. "Rough men. Not for your eyes." Eleanor thanked him. And over his shoulder, without turning her head, she watched the two ranch hands the whole way past, watched which one carried his weight on his back foot, watched the one with his hand drifting toward his belt. She read that little quarrel the way another woman might read a grocery list, quick and complete, and then she looked back up at the deputy and stammered something about the fine weather. Cole Ferris she noticed on the third day. He was the sort of man a town like Cottonwood Fork doesn't quite know what to do with, and so it flatters him. He called himself a cattle buyer. Said he was waiting on a herd coming up from the panhandle, waiting to make an offer, and while he waited he took a room at the hotel, and he bought drinks, and he charmed the widows, and he listened, always listened. He wore good boots, fine leather, tooled at the top. Eleanor saw the boots on the third day, and something in her went very still. Because those boots had never touched a stockyard. She knew stockyard boots. She knew the way manure and lime and the churned muck of a cattle pen eats the leather at the seams and stains it in a way no polish takes out. Ferris's boots were clean at the welt, clean where a cattleman's would be ruined. A man who bought cattle for his living did not have boots like that. She said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing. It was, in fact, the thing she was best at in all the world. It was at the general store, in the second week, that the town first saw her do the thing she did. She'd come in for thread and a pot of ink. The store was crowded, mid-morning, ranch wives and a couple of hands, and a drifter who'd come off the trail with dust an inch thick on him. Eleanor stood at the counter waiting on the clerk, a boy named Petey, and she was looking at the ink pots, and she wasn't looking at the drifter at all. Not directly. But she saw his hand close over a jackknife on the counter display, saw it go, smooth and slow, into the pocket of his coat. The left pocket, the inside one, over his heart. Petey came back with her thread, and Eleanor leaned in and she said, so low it barely carried, the man in the brown coat. "There's a jackknife gone from your case. Inside left pocket." And then, quick, like she'd frightened herself, she added, "Oh, forgive me. I shouldn't have said. It's not my place." Petey stared at her. Then he came around the counter, and he stopped the drifter at the door, and he asked him, polite but firm, to turn out his coat. The drifter blustered, but the jackknife was there. Inside left pocket, over the heart, exactly where the little schoolmarm had said. The store buzzed about it for an hour. But not the way you'd think. Nobody said, "That woman has a sharp eye." They said, "Wasn't it a lucky thing she happened to glance over?" They said, "Imagine, a mouse of a girl like that, catching a thief." It embarrassed her, they decided. And they were half right. She kept her eyes down and apologized to Petey twice more and hurried out. And on her way out, without any thought at all, she noted the store's two doors, the front and the one behind the flour barrels that led to the alley. She counted them. 2 ways out. She always knew the ways out. She could no more stop counting them than stop breathing. She hated that she still did it. She'd come 2,000 miles to stop. There was an evening, not long after, tea at Mrs. Abernathy's, the ladies' circle gathered close and warm. Eleanor poured, and her hand shook. The pot rattled against the cup, tea slopping into the saucer, and the women all made soft sounds, and Mrs. Abernathy said, "Never mind, dear, never mind," and took the pot from her gently. Eleanor tucked her hand into her lap. She was ashamed of the tremor. It came and went. It had come and gone for 2 years now, ever since. Well, ever since. And then there was shouting in the street. 2 men, a real fight this time, fists and then one of them going for something at his hip. The women crowded to the window with little cries, and Eleanor rose and went to the glass with them, and she looked out, and for as long as she watched that fight her hand did not shake, not once. It lay flat and steady on the windowsill, dead calm, calm as still water, while a man's fingers closed on the grip of a pistol below. The deputy broke it up before it came to shooting. The women went back to their tea, fluttering, and Eleanor stood a moment longer at the window and looked down at her own hand. Steady, perfectly steady. She turned it over and looked at the palm as if it belonged to somebody else. She went home early that night. She said she had a headache, and in her bedroom, alone, she knelt by the quilt-covered trunk in the corner, and she put her hand flat on the lid, and she did not open it. She just pressed the lid down a little tighter, the way you'd settle a lid on a pot that wanted to boil over. Then she went to bed and lay awake a long while. The social came at the end of that second week. The whole town turned out. Trestle tables under the cottonwoods, fiddle music, the smell of fried chicken and dust, and it was there, in front of everyone, that Cole Ferris took her measure and found her small. Eleanor sat at the edge of it all, as she liked to. She watched. She watched Ferris move through the crowd. He was working. She could see it plain even if no one else could. He wasn't buying cattle, and he wasn't courting widows. He was counting. He stood by the bank on the walk over, and his eyes went to the window bars, the iron ones over the front glass, and he priced them. She saw him price them. A man thinking about how a thing is built is thinking about how to get into it. Deputy Callum found her there, of course. He brought her a plate. He sat beside her and cut her chicken for her. Cut it into small pieces without asking, and said she'd want it manageable, a little thing like her. The women nearby smiled. Eleanor thanked him. She ate a small piece of chicken. And Ferris, seeing this, seeing the deputy fussing over the mouse of a schoolteacher, made his joke. He stood, and he tipped his hat to the gathering, and he said it loud enough for all of them. "Careful, gentlemen, the little schoolteacher looks like she'd faint at a loud door." And they laughed. 40 of them, more, a warm ripple of it under the cottonwoods, the deputy loudest of all. Eleanor did not faint. She did not color. She looked at Cole Ferris, and she watched his left hand where it rested at his belt, and she saw his thumb tap against the leather. Tap, tap, tap. A small nervous habit a smooth man doesn't know he has. She filed it away where she filed everything. She said, softly, to the deputy beside her, that the chicken was very good. "Thank you," and she looked at no one, and everyone laughed on, and the moment passed. But the town wasn't done making her small. The last straw came at the schoolboard, and it was the loudest misjudgment of all, and it was done with the kindest faces you ever saw. They called a meeting. Callum was behind it, though he let one of the older board members do the talking. The man cleared his throat, and he said that they'd all been watching Miss Shaw with great affection, and that they wondered, only for her own sake, only out of care, whether the older boys mightn't be too much for her. Big farm boys, some of them near grown, rough, it was a great deal to ask of a young lady of her constitution. They proposed a steadier man come in. Co-teach. Take the older ones off her hands. For her nerves. The whole room looked at her with such tenderness, such pity. And Eleanor folded her hands in her lap and she said, "Soft, of course. If you think it's best, of course." And they all felt so good about themselves. They'd protected the poor, delicate creature. She heard them murmuring approval of their own kindness as she rose to go. She was, by that evening, entirely invisible. A woman the whole town had agreed to see as nothing more than a nervous girl who needed managing. She could not have arranged a better disguise if she'd worked at it for a year. The Cattlemen's Bank sat at the far end of the street, brick, solid, the pride of Cottonwood Fork. Horace Bell ran it. He was a careful man, with soft hands and a hard ledger, and that spring he was holding more money than the bank usually saw, and everyone knew it. Because the ranchers had pooled their quarterly mortgage payments there, and the Silverton mine had put its payroll in the vault, waiting on the escort that would carry it up the mountain. $11,400. All told, $11,400 sat behind the iron door of Horace Bell's vault. It was the most money that had ever been in one place in that town, and there was hardly a soul who didn't know the sum. Bell reminded the ranchers, that same week, that their notes came due. 12 days, he told them, standing on the bank steps in his black coat. The quarterly notes were due in 12 days, and he'd be needing them paid on the day, gentlemen, business being business. The ranchers grumbled and went home to scrape it together. 12 days. Remember that too. It was a Tuesday, and it was near noon when the 5 men came. They came up the street riding easy, no hurry, dusters and low hats, and it was only when they swung down in front of the bank and pulled the bandanas up over their faces that anyone understood. 5 masks. 5 drawn pistols. 2 stayed with the horses. 3 went through the doors. The street emptied like water off a table. Folks ran, or froze, or ducked behind whatever was near. Eleanor was in the schoolhouse. She had a room full of children, and the sound of shooting could start at any second, and she did the first thing that mattered. She got them down. Away from the windows, back against the far wall, low, she kept her voice light. She made it a game. Almost. Hush now. Down we go. That's it. The little ones didn't understand, and the big ones were pale, and she kept every one of them calm and back from the glass. And then, herself, she went to the window. Not in front of it. To the side of it, at the edge of the frame, where the light wouldn't catch her and mark her as a watcher. And she watched the bank. Her hand, resting on the window's edge, was steady, perfectly, wholly steady. She watched for 90 seconds. It felt to the children like an hour, and to Eleanor like nothing at all, like a thing she'd done 100 times. Because she had. She watched the 2 men holding the horses. She watched the door. And when the 3 inside came back out with the canvas sacks, she watched them cross the boardwalk and mount up, and she watched the way each one of them moved. She didn't tell herself why she was doing it. She'd have said, if you'd asked her, that she was only making sure they rode off. But her eyes went over those 5 men the way a seamstress's fingers go over a bolt of cloth, feeling for every flaw. And by the time they spurred out of town and were gone in their own dust, Eleanor Shaw knew things about those 5 masked men that not one other person in Cottonwood Fork had thought to learn. She knew which one favored his left hand. She knew one of them wore town boots and not range boots. She knew one was too small for his coat and wiped his hands twice on his thighs. She knew one of them held his shotgun the way a man holds a thing that has hurt him. And she knew the leader, the one who never touched a sack, who sat his horse and watched the street and tapped his left thumb against his belt while he waited. Tap, 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 she knew all of it. And she got the children up off the floor and dusted them off and told them how brave they'd been, and she did not say a word about what she'd seen. Not yet. The town came apart. After, Marshal Gideon Price came pounding up the street too late, as everyone always is too late, and he stood in the ransacked bank, with Horace Bell wringing his soft hands and saying $11,400, $11,400, over and over, like the number itself might bring it back. They got up a posse. Deputy Callum ran it, loud and sure, 20 men on horses milling in the street. And Callum, certain of himself, pointed them south down the Panhandle Road, because that's the way strangers came, and they thundered off in a cloud, and Eleanor stood on the schoolhouse step and watched them go the wrong way. The men had ridden east. She'd seen them turn east past the churchyard, but nobody asked the schoolmarm, and the schoolmarm did not offer. They came back at dark with nothing. They went out again the next day, and came back with nothing. No faces, the marshal said, when the ranchers pressed him. No witnesses saw a thing worth having. Masked men, gone like smoke. And the whole while Horace Bell stood in his doorway in his black coat and reminded anyone who'd listen that the notes still came due. 10 days now. The money stolen or not, the notes came due, and a man who couldn't pay would lose his land. That was simply the arithmetic of it. Marshal Price was an honest man and a tired one, and he could feel this thing slipping past him. And it was eating him alive. He knew what it meant. Families off their land. The mine gone quiet, its payroll stolen, and if the mine went quiet, the town went quiet, everyone drifting off to somewhere with work. He knew he was watching Cottonwood Fork begin to die, and he could not find one thread to pull. Eleanor watched all of it, and on the 4th night after the robbery, she did a thing she had not done since the day she'd arrived. She unlocked the trunk. She waited until full dark. She lit one candle. She knelt on the floor of her bedroom, and she took a small key from a ribbon around her neck, a key she'd worn against her skin every day and every night for 2 years, and she fit it to the lock, and she opened the lid. There wasn't much in it. Some folded clothes she never wore, a man's watch that had stopped, and under a false paper bottom she'd built herself 2 things. The first was a document. Heavy paper, an official seal, folded in 3. A commission. It named her. It bore the mark of an agency out of Chicago, and it said, in the dry language of such things, that the bearer was an operative in good standing, and it was signed by men whose names meant something in the wide dark country between the Mississippi and the mountains. The second was a pin. Small, brass, no bigger than a coat button, stamped into it was an open eye. And under the eye, 3 words worn nearly smooth from being held. We never sleep. Eleanor Shaw held the pin in her palm and looked at it a long time by the one candle. Her hand did not shake. She turned it over. She thought about a night on a rail line in Kansas 2 years gone, a night she did not let herself think about, a man beside her who was not beside her anymore, and the sound a certain kind of gun makes very close to your ear, and the reason her hand shook now over teacups and did not shake at all over trouble. Then she set the pin back in the trunk, under the false bottom, and she folded the commission over it, and she closed the lid, and she turned the key. She hung the ribbon back around her neck. She'd come to Cottonwood Fork to be no one. To stop being the woman who saw everything. She'd wanted to teach children their sums and pour tea with a shaking hand and be managed by kind women and be nothing. Nothing at all. And safe in being nothing. But she'd stood at that window and watched 5 men she could name if she chose to. And out there in the dark, ranchers she'd taught the children of were 10 days from losing everything they had. And a mine payroll that fed 100 families was gone, and an honest marshal was breaking his heart against a wall he couldn't climb. She lay awake the whole of that night. She heard the town clock strike every hour. And in the gray before dawn she got up, and she washed her face, and she put on her plain gray dress, and she pinned her hair, and she looked at herself in the little mirror for a long moment, a small, plain woman with a nervous mouth. That was what they saw. That was what she'd worked so hard for them to see. She walked down the empty street in the first light, past the bank with its broken lock, past the closed store, all the way to the marshal's office at the end of the row. There was a lamp burning in the window. Price hadn't slept either. Eleanor stood on the step a moment. Her heart was going hard. Her hand, when she raised it to the door, trembled. She looked at it tremble. And she thought, let it. Let it shake. She knocked anyway. The marshal opened the door. He looked down at her, this slip of a schoolteacher on his step at dawn, and she saw him get ready to be gentle with her, to tell her to go on home, that this was no business for her, that she oughtn't trouble her nerves over rough men's doings. Eleanor Shaw folded her trembling hands in front of her, and she looked up at Marshal Gideon Price, and in a soft voice that stammered only a little, she said the words she had come 2,000 miles to never have to say again. "Marshal, I'd like to tell you what I saw." Marshal Price looked at her a long moment. Then he stepped back and let her in. The office smelled of cold coffee and gun oil. There was a map on the wall with pins stuck in it, all of them pointing south. Eleanor looked at those pins and said nothing about them yet. She sat where he pointed. She folded her hands in her lap. "Miss Shaw," he said, and his voice was kind and tired. "You've had a fright. We all have. But this, 5 men," she said. They came from the alley behind the feed store at 9 minutes past 2. They were inside for a minute and a half. They rode out east, past the churchyard, not south. "Your posse is looking in the wrong place, Marshal. It has been for 4 days." The kindness went out of his face. Something else came into it. He sat down slow across from her. "Go on," he said. The door banged open before she could. It was Callum. He had his hat pushed back and his thumbs in his belt, and when he saw her sitting there, he laughed. Not cruel, just certain. "Marshal, don't tell me. The schoolmarms come to solve the robbery." He grinned around the room like there was a crowd in it to grin at. "Miss Shaw, this is real kind of you. But you ought to be resting. This kind of talk'll wear on your nerves." Eleanor looked at her hands. They were trembling. She let them. "Deputy," she said softly. "Would you sit down, please now, ma'am? Sit down. Roy," that was Price. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Callum sat. Eleanor drew a breath, and then she began, and while she spoke her hands shook in her lap, and her voice caught and stammered on the small words, the way it always did, the way it had done over teacups and church suppers for 2 months while the town smiled at her. But the things the voice said did not stammer at all. "The first man was left-handed," she said. He held the sack in his right hand and worked the door with his left. He wore town boots, flat heels, thin soles, city-made, not range boots. A man who rides doesn't wear those. I have seen those boots before. She looked up. 2 weeks ago, a drifter took a jackknife off the counter at the general store. Petey didn't see it go. I did. Left hand, into the left coat pocket. Same boots. He's lodging above the saloon still. He didn't leave, because leaving looks like guilt, and he thinks he was never seen. Price was very still. "Send for him," she said. "You'll find the knife on him or in his room. A man like that keeps small things." Callum opened his mouth. Price lifted one finger, and Callum shut it. The marshal got up and went to the door and called for a man to go and fetch the drifter. Quiet, no fuss. Then he came back and sat down. "The second," he said. It was not a question anymore. "The second man you won't want to hear," Eleanor said. "The second man is from here." The office went quiet. He favored his right knee. When he swung down off his horse, he took the weight on his left and let the right come after, slow, the way a man does with an old hurt in the joint, and his thumbnail was split. The right thumb, split down the middle, grown back in 2 halves. "I have shot exactly one thing in this town, Marshal, and it was my mare, and the man who did it was Wallace Tibbet at the livery. And he held her hoof against that right knee and I watched him favor it, and he had a split thumbnail, and I thought nothing of it at all until I saw that same hand come out of that bank with a canvas sack in it." Callum was on his feet. "Now hold on. Wallace? Wallace Tibbet's shod every horse in this county for 9 years. You're going to stand there and—" "His knee will be swollen tonight," Eleanor said. Not to Callum, to Price. "From the riding. Send someone to look before you say a word to him. You'll see it before you ask him a single question. And when you take him, look in the loft over the livery. A man hides money where he goes every day, and no one thinks twice. Price looked at her for a long moment. Then he sent a second man out the door. The third, he said. The third was a boy. Her voice softened. He was too small for his coat. The sleeves were rolled, and still they swallowed his hands. And twice, while he stood by the door with the shotgun, he wiped his palms on his thigh. Down the front of his trousers, both hands, like a nervous habit, like a boy who works with his hands white all day and can't stop wiping them clean even when there's nothing on them. She paused. The Kessler boy helps his uncle at the bakehouse. Flour to the elbow. Every morning. I've watched him wipe his hands on his trousers 100 times through the schoolhouse window while the bread cart goes by. He's 15, Marshal. He was frightened half to death behind that mask. He'll tell you everything if you're gentle. Callum sat down again. He didn't say anything this time. Price leaned forward. There was sweat on his forehead, though the morning was cool. You counted their guns, he said slowly. I sent men out counting guns. 5 men, so and so many pistols, a shotgun. That's what we had. I counted their guns too, Marshal. Eleanor met his eyes. But then I counted their hands. Their hands were the thing they forgot to hide. A man will put a mask on his face and never once think about what his hands say. Your robbers wore masks over the one part of them that lies. They left bare the part that can't. Nobody spoke. Somewhere out on the street the town clock struck 7, the 4th, Price said, and his voice had gone quiet and rough. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She looked down at her own hands, still shaking there in her lap, and for the first time that morning something moved across her face that wasn't Schoolmarm and wasn't operative. It was just a woman remembering. The 4th man had been burned, she said. Once, a while ago. The side of his neck above the collar was slick and shiny, the way skin goes when powder takes it and it heals wrong. And he held the shotgun wrong. Or not wrong. Careful, he held it out and away and braced, the way a man holds a gun after a gun has already hurt him once. There's a fear that gets into the body. It doesn't go where the mind can reach it. The hands keep it. She was quiet a second. I know that hold, Marshal. I have seen it before. On other people. And I have felt my own hands do a thing my mind told them not to do, and not be able to stop them. She looked up. Her eyes were dry. That's a man who's been shot near a gun going off. You'll find the scar on his neck. You'll find he flinches at a slammed door. She almost smiled. There was a man at the social said I looked like I'd faint at a loud door. He didn't know he was describing his own partner. Callum's head came up slow. The 5th, said Price. The 5th man, Eleanor said, is Cole Ferris. The name dropped into the room like a stone into a well. Ferris. Callum breathed it. The cattle buyer. Marshal. The man's been drinking with the ranchers for 3 weeks. He's a cattle buyer who has never once ridden out to look at a cow, Eleanor said. 3 weeks in a cattle town and he has not gone to a single ranch. Not walked a single pen. His boots are clean. Not new. Clean. A man who buys cattle has manure worked so deep into the welt of his boot, it never comes out, not with a week of scrubbing. Cole Ferris's boots have never smelled a stockyard. I noticed it the first day. I noticed it and I told myself it wasn't my business. She stood up. She hadn't meant to. It just happened, and once she was up, she stayed up, small and gray in the middle of that room. At the church social, he stood by the window with a glass in his hand, and everyone thought he was admiring the view, and he was counting the iron bars on the bank across the street. His eyes went along them one at a time. I watched him do it. And the whole time, his left thumb tapped against his belt. Tap, tap, tap. A man does that when he's thinking hard and holding still. He did it at the social. He did it in front of the bank the morning before, standing on the boardwalk. And he did it coming out of that door 4 days ago with $11,400 in a sack. Because even behind a mask, even in the middle of the thing he'd planned for weeks, his thumb went tap, tap, tap against his belt. The room was silent. That's your leader, Marshal, the man who told a room full of 40 people that the little schoolteacher looked like she'd faint at a loud door. Her voice didn't shake now. She noticed that, distantly, it had stopped. He never looked at me twice. None of them did. That's why I could count them. You can't be watched by a man who's decided you're not worth watching. Marshal Price sat back in his chair. He looked at her the way a man looks at deep water he's just realized he's standing in. And then, because he was an honest man, and because 4 of his days had died looking south while she stood at a window looking east, he said the thing that cost him. Miss Shaw. How does a schoolteacher know a powder scar from a birthmark? How does a schoolteacher know how a shot man holds a gun? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Wire the Pinkerton agency in Chicago, she said. Ask them about an operative named E. Shaw, and then, if you want, you can decide whether to believe a word I've said. She sat back down. She folded her trembling hands. And she waited. He wired that morning. He wired before the drifter was even brought in, and the drifter was brought in by 10, with a bone-handled jackknife in his coat pocket and left-handed and wearing city boots, and he broke inside of an hour. Wallace Tibbet's right knee was swollen up like a melon when they went to the livery, and the money was in the loft, in the canvas sacks, under the loose hay by the pulley where he pitched feed down every day of his life. The Kessler boy cried before they'd asked him a single question. The 4th man had a shiny burn scar the width of a hand up the side of his neck. By the time the reply came from Denver, relayed up the line from Chicago, there was not a man in the office who doubted her. But they read it anyway, out loud. Because Price said it ought to be read out loud, and because the school board chairman had come by then, and Mrs. Abernathy, and Horace Bell, and half the ladies' circle, all of them crowded into that little office, because word had gone through Cottonwood Fork like fire in dry grass that the schoolmarm had named the robbers, every one, before breakfast. Price held the telegram in both hands. He read it slow. Operative E. Shaw, he read. In good standing, commended twice, retired 2 years past following the Kansas rail case. He paused. The paper trembled a little in his hands now, the way hers did. Partner killed in the line. Operative Shaw wounded in the same action. Highest recommendation. The agency asks to be remembered to her. Nobody moved. There was a man in the doorway who hadn't been there a minute before. A traveling man, a railroad detective who'd come in on the morning stage, bound somewhere else, and stopped when he heard the noise. He was an older man with gray in his mustache, and he'd been standing in the back listening with his hat on, and now, slow, he took his hat off. I worked a line beside E. Shaw, he said quietly, out of Topeka, 6 years back. Best set of eyes the agency ever put in the field. I heard she died in Kansas. He looked at her, at the small gray woman in the chair, with her hands shaking in her lap. I'm glad the half of that's a lie is the half that is. The office was so quiet you could hear the clock. Mrs. Abernathy had her hand at her throat. The school board chairman, who 2 weeks past had proposed with such gentleness that a steadier man co-teach the older boys for the poor girl's nerves, stood there and could not find one word. And Deputy Roy Callum, who had cut her meat at the church social so she wouldn't tremble it off her plate, who had laughed in this very room not 3 hours before, stood against the wall gone white as paper. He had watched every name he mocked come true. The drifter. The livery hand's swollen knee. The boy. The scar. He looked like a man who'd stepped off a stair that wasn't there. He came across the room to her. He took his hat off, and he held it in both hands, and he looked at the floor. Miss Shaw, he said. His voice was not loud now. It was the smallest she had ever heard it. "I owe you an apology I don't have the size of words for. I made a fool of myself at your expense in front of the whole town. And you let me. You could have." He stopped. His jaw worked. "You could have put me in my place any day these 2 months, and you never did." Eleanor looked up at him. She could have said a great many things. The room was waiting to see which one she'd choose, whether she'd make him small, the way he'd made her small, and God knew she had it coming to her, and it would have been sweet. "Deputy," she said gently, "there's a warrant to be drawn for Wallace Timid, and it ought to be done right, in a proper hand, so no lawyer can slip him loose on a technicality. You write a fine clear hand, Roy. I've seen the notices you post." She held his eyes. "Would you draw it up? The marshal has a great deal to do this morning." For a moment, Callum didn't understand. And then he did. She had handed him work. Useful work. Real work. Work that mattered. And she'd done it in front of everyone, so that the last thing the town saw was not Roy Callum humiliated, but Roy Callum trusted with something. She'd given him a way to stand up straight while he still could. His eyes went bright. He put his hat on. "Yes, ma'am," he said, rough. "I'll draw it careful." And he went to the desk, and he did. They took the 5 of them, without a shot fired. That was the part the town told longest afterward, in the years that came. Not a gun drawn, not a window broken, no posse thundering off in a cloud. Just a marshal with a list of names and a schoolteacher's word, going door to door on a bright morning, and by noon on the 12th day. The very day the notes came due, all 5 were in the 2 cells behind the office, and the $11,400 was stacked on Horace Bell's counter in the canvas sacks it had left in. Bell counted it twice, with the whole town watching through his windows. Every dollar was there. Timid hadn't spent a cent. There'd been no time. And when Bell had counted it the second time, and could not make it come out to anything but whole, he looked up and found 40 faces at his glass. Ranchers mostly, men who'd stood 12 days from losing the ground their fathers broke, and their wives beside them, and he understood that he was going to lift those foreclosures. Now. This morning, with all of them watching, and that there was no ledger in the world worth being the man who didn't. He lifted them. He came out onto the boardwalk and said the notes would stand at the old terms, and the quarter would be forgiven for the trouble, and the ranchers didn't cheer. They just took their hats off, most of them, and a few of the older ones had to look away down the street at nothing for a while. Cole Ferris was the last one they brought out. They walked him down the row past the same boardwalk where he'd tipped his hat to the ladies for 3 weeks, past the same 40 people who had chuckled when he called her a mouse. His hands were bound. His fine coat had straw on it from the cell. And he saw her. She was standing by the schoolhouse steps, small and gray, her hands folded in front of her. She wasn't there to gloat. She'd have gone home if she could have. But Price had asked her to be present in case he needed her to confirm the man, and so she stood there, and Cole Ferris looked at her, and something crossed his smooth face that had never been there before. Confusion. Real confusion. Like a man doing a sum that won't come right. "You," he said. He stopped, and the marshal let him stop a moment. The schoolteacher. He looked at her boots, her plain dress, her nervous folded hands, and back to her face, and she watched him try to fit the 2 things together and fail. "How?" he said. Just the one word. "How?" "You never watch faces," Eleanor said quietly. "You watch purses and windows and iron bars. You looked at everything in this town that could be counted in dollars, and you never once looked at a face that wasn't going to hand you money." She almost felt sorry for him. "Almost. That's how, Mr. Ferris. You told a whole room I'd faint at a loud door. You should have wondered why I didn't." His mouth opened. Nothing came out of it, and Marshal Price put a hand on his arm and walked him on, past the 40 who'd laughed, and not one of them was laughing now. The colt came 3 days later. Nobody saw who brought it. It was just there in the morning, tied to the schoolhouse rail, a young saddled bay with a white star, and a note on the horn in a rancher's careful pencil that said only, "For the teacher," with the county's thanks. And through that week they came, the men whose land she'd saved without ever touching a gun, 1 and 2 at a time, on their way past. They didn't make speeches. Cottonwood Fork wasn't a place for speeches. They'd rein up at the rail and take their hats off and hold them a moment, looking at her in the schoolhouse door with the children behind her. And then they'd put their hats back on and ride on. That was all. That was everything. The ladies' circle came too. Mrs. Abernathy at the head of them, stiff and pink and not knowing how to begin, because how do you apologize for a kindness that was really a cruelty? For managing a woman who never once needed managing. So she didn't try. She just took Eleanor's 2 trembling hands in her 2 soft ones and held them, and said, "You'll come to circle Thursday. And you'll sit wherever you like, and say as much or as little as suits you, and no one will ever again cut your meat." And Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and said she'd come. That was the summer of it. And then it was late summer, and the fuss died down the way fuss does, and Cottonwood Fork went back to being a small town on a fork of a small river in a big empty country, and Eleanor Shaw went on being the school teacher. She still stammered over the little things. That never left her. Her hand still shook pouring tea at the circle on Thursdays, and the ladies had learned not to reach for the pot, to let her manage it, spilling a little, in her own time. And her hand still went dead steady the one afternoon a bull got loose on Main Street and a child stood frozen in its path, and it was the school teacher who walked out calm and slow and took the child by the collar and drew her back, cool as still water, while grown men shouted. She noticed it in herself, the way she always had, the shake for the small things, the stillness for the large. She'd stopped fighting it. It was just how she was made now. After Kansas, after the man who used to be beside her wasn't anymore. She'd stopped needing to understand it. The locked trunk still stood in the corner of her room. But she didn't keep it locked now. The little key on its ribbon she still wore around her neck, out of habit, out of memory, because the man's stopped watch was in there and always would be, and she liked knowing where it was. But the commission, and the brass pin with the open eye and the words that said "we never sleep," those she took out. The pin lived in her desk drawer at the schoolhouse now, not hidden under a false bottom, under a quilt, 2,000 miles from anyone. Just in the shallow drawer with the chalk and the red pencils and the spare slate, where her hand found it a dozen times a day reaching for something else. Out, not hidden. She'd decided she was done hiding. It turned out the safest thing had never been to be no one. The safest thing was to be exactly who she was and let the town make its peace with it. They had. There was chalk dust hanging gold in the slant of the afternoon light the day Roy Callum stopped by the schoolhouse in October. He was a different man since the spring, quieter, steadier, and Price had come to lean on him, and it suited him better than the loudness ever had. He leaned in the doorway with his hat in his hand and watched her wipe down the board. "Miss Shaw," he said, "board meets Thursday. They're talking again about the older boys, the Rafferty pair, and the Doyle boy, the big ones, the ones that give trouble." He turned the hat in his hands, old habit, choosing his words, and then he found the wrong ones anyway, the way a man does. "I only mean, if it'd help, I could look in of an afternoon. With the difficult ones, take some of that off you." Eleanor Shaw set down her cloth. She looked at him a moment in the gold light, this deputy who'd cut her meat, and she wasn't unkind about it. She never was. She just let a small dry smile touch her nervous mouth. "I'll manage the difficult ones, deputy," she said. And Callum looked at her, and then he laughed, low, at himself, and put his hat on. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "I expect you will." And he touched the brim and went on down the road. Eleanor stood in the empty schoolhouse a while. The dust turned slow in the light. Outside, the town went on about its evening, unhurried, safe, 100 small sounds of it drifting in the open door. She picked up her cloth and finished the board. The sharpest eye in the county, and it kept the quietest voice. And that was how she liked it. Respect. She'd learned a long time ago, and 2,000 miles from here isn't the loud thing. It's the thing that comes and stands at your rail with its hat off and doesn't say a word. It's earned in silence. It always was. She locked the schoolhouse, though there was nothing in it worth taking but chalk and a brass pin she no longer bothered to hide, and she walked home through the long gold light of a Colorado evening in the year 1878. If you've ever been the quiet one nobody thought to watch, the one they underestimated, right up until the day they couldn't, tell me the town you're watching from tonight. I'd like to know where you are. The road home was short, maybe a quarter mile, and she had walked it so many times by now that her feet knew the soft places and the stones without her telling them. The cottonwoods had gone yellow and were losing leaves the slow, patient way they do in that country, one at a time, like they were considering each one before they let it go. She walked through them. The light coming down through the remaining leaves was thin and warm, the last real warmth of the day, and it lay across the dirt road in pale shapes that shifted when a breeze moved and then settled again. She was not thinking about Roy Callum. She had stopped thinking about Roy Callum the moment he'd touched his hat brim and walked away, which was, if she was being honest with herself, within about 4 seconds of him going. He was a good man, and she had no quarrel with him. She simply had no space in her head where he could put himself down and stay. The space in her head was full of other things, the 3 Rafferty girls and the way the eldest had started reading ahead. The Doyle boy, who was not difficult, not really, but was angry, and anger and difficulty were not the same thing, and most people confused them. She didn't. She knew what to do with the anger. You gave it somewhere useful to go, and then you stood back and let it go there. The boy was going to be fine. She'd known it since September. She paused on the road. Not for any reason. Just because the light was doing something particular in the west, going that deep copper color against a sky that had started to purple at the edges. And she had never once in her life been able to walk past a Colorado sky doing something like that. She stood there in the road with her satchel and looked at it. There was the smell of someone's supper fire. Wood smoke and something savory, maybe a stew, coming from one of the houses set back from the road. From another direction, farther off, a horse and the small jangle of its bridle. The sound of a door, a child's voice, cut off when the door closed again. Evening coming in piece by piece, the way it always did here, unhurried, thorough, not making any announcement about itself. She breathed it in, all of it, the copper light and the wood smoke and the cooling air that smelled faintly of pine from the slopes above, and she let herself feel the fullness of it. This particular evening in this particular place, because she had learned that things this good went fast, and it was worth stopping to feel them on purpose. The satchel was light. A woman who'd come 2,000 miles with nothing had learned to carry only what she needed, and what she needed kept turning out to be less than she'd thought. She walked on home through the long gold light,